Hi guys. So I've been seeing some things that are kind of linking together in my mind, and I wanted to do a video about it because I'm starting to see some parallels from history as to the times that we're living in right now. And what I want to do is kind of go over them and see where the similarities are. So Biden's climate change agenda to bring meat passports. Americans may be limited to 4 pounds of meat per year under the plan. The violation of everything it means to live in a free country. In addition to changing the kind of cars we drive, because they want us to drive electrical cars, and how we heat our homes, Biden's plans may force Americans to limit our consumption of red meat. In Biden's version of America, you will have to cut your consumption of red by a whopping total of 90%. According to a study from Michigan University Center for Sustainable Systems, to meet the changes proposed by Joe Biden, Americans would only be allowed to consume 4 pounds of red meat annually. To put that in perspective, your red meat consumption should be limited to one typical hamburger per month. Imagine being limited to one hamburger per month and not being able to eat red meat. Will the government require us to have red meat passports to ensure that we don't go over our quota of red meat? If government officials think they can control your behavior based on whether you've been vaccinated, and what's to stop them from using the same idea to limit our consumption of red meat because of quote unquote the environment? Now, that's a very good question, and I'll show you why. Let's see if I can find this patent here. So, this is a patent by Microsoft, and this is what eventually is going to come, right, with how they're going to do this is they're going to say that too many people are falsifying their Fochin records and that it's putting people in harm's way. I've already seen there's a Wall Street Journal article last week where they were saying that the airports were now, having to hunt down whether people are really vaccinated or not. So here is the patent for this cryptocurrency system using body activity data. A cryptocurrency system comprising of one or more processors and memory storable execution instructions that, if executed by one or more of the processors, configure the cryptocurrency system to communicate with the device of a user, receive body activity data, which is generated based on body activity data of the user, wherein the body activity is sensed by a sensor communicatively coupled or compromised in the device of the user. Verify if the body activity data of the user satisfies one or more conditions set by the cryptocurrency system, and awards cryptocurrency to the user whose body activity data is verified. You see how they're going to do this? Right? You not only have to have the Fochin, but it's going to be a cryptocurrency. You're going to be awarded cryptocurrency based upon whether you're a good boy or a good girl and you do what the government tells you. So let's talk more about this. Does Biden's climate agenda mean red meat passports are coming? Joe Biden's climate agenda, which he announced this week, is such a violation of everything it means to live in a free country that it actually is hard to understand how he thinks he can get away with it. Well, he thinks he can get away with it because this is the world government, right? This is the evil creatures that rule over us, the switch skeletons. This is how they roll, and I'm going to show you about history. The plan, announced during a 2-day climate summit that began on Earth Day, calls for the slashing of carbon emissions by over half in less than 10 years and the United States becoming a zero emissions economy by 2050, meaning we're all going to be pretty much dead or in the Hunger Games scenario, living out on some freaking gulag, right? While Biden hasn't released the details of this plan yet, experts say that it will take huge changes to accomplish Biden's climate objectives. I mean, how is this person even allowed to do this? While electric cars currently make up only 2% of new passenger vehicle sales, yeah, because they suck, Biden's insane objectives would require electric vehicles to make up 65% of new cars and SUVs, along with 10% of new truck sales. I mean, who is this person, right? Think about it. Who is this guy to say all this? He's not even a legislator. If your home is heated by oil or natural gas, you'll have to get an electric heat pump installed. Experts say the economic shifts of Biden's plan will cost Americans trillions of dollars. But worse yet, in addition to changing the kind of cars we drive and how we heat our homes, Biden's plan may force our Americans to limit our consumption of red meat. Yeah, which means people like me who get anemia will be dying because you can't even breathe when you have anemia. That's right. Biden's version of America, you will have to cut your consumption of red by a whopping 90%, according to the study for the Michigan University Center for Sustainable Systems. To meet the proposed changes proposed by Joe Biden, Americans would only be allowed to consume 4 pounds of red meat annually. I already read that part, sorry. Is that so far out of the realm of possibility? Remember the vaccine passport? Yes, that's what I'm telling you. This all ties together, right? The vaccine, right, with the quantum dot tattoo, which will have this technology in it. And that's how you will be starved to death or not. If government officials think they can control your behavior based on whether you've been vaccinated, what's to stop them from using the same idea to limit our consumption of red meat because of the quote unquote environment? Of course. That's why Bill Gates has bought up half of the freaking land in America. They don't want you. And then Oregon this week is trying to get rid of animal agriculture, and Colorado is also. They have bills in their house they're putting forward. Yes, Biden hasn't released how he plans to impose this insane climate agenda, but when experts say our red meat consumption may be under assault to make it happen, we should take that threat seriously. We must defend our rights to eat burgers whenever we want. I mean, meat, we are predators. Okay? I'm going to show you guys some crocodile videos. I may have to split this into 2 videos. We are predators. How do you weaken a predator? Feed them flour, feed them oats, because you can't, all it is a little bit of energy. There is no nutrition in it for you because you are not able to ferment plant life into volatile fatty acids. That means you're a predator. If you could ferment plants into volatile fatty acids, you would be some sort of herbivore, or you'd be an omnivore like a pig, right? A hog can ferment about 40% of its diet from grass, but it has to have animal fat as well, or it dies. It has to eat meat, just like we do. And we have to have even more because we do not have the ability to ferment grass, or nobody would have ever starved to death. So let's talk about some stuff you never hear about. Cannibal Island. This is Nazino Island. It's in Siberia. Cannibal Island. In 1933, nearly 5,000 died in one of Stalin's most horrific labor camps. Tomsk, Russia. Every year, a small group of locals travels the 550 kilometers northwest from this Siberian city to Nazinsky Island in the middle of the Ob River to place a wreath at the foot of the wooden cross. It is a gesture of remembrance for the victims of the horrific events that unfolded there in the summer of 1933. Every year in June, we place a wreath at the cross that was placed on the island in 1993. Valeria Tolkien. Oh, I didn't say that right. Tolkien told RFE/RL. But this year we couldn't go. The water was too high and the island is almost entirely flooded. Their dedication to the pilgrimage is part of an effort to remind fellow Russians of the experiment in social engineering and self-sufficiency that went tragically wrong for many of the quote-unquote settlers lured by Soviet authorities under Joseph Stalin, whose brutal excesses have frequently been downplayed by Russia's current leadership and by everyone. Right? All we ever hear about is the Holocaust, the Holocaust, the Holocaust. You don't hear about Stalin murdering like 30 million or more people. I mean, compared to Stalin and like Mao and Deng Xiaoping, Hitler is an amateur, right? I mean, if you really look at the straight up numbers. And we never hear about this. And why is that? Because they want you to believe that Marxism, right, that socialism, communism are good. But even if you look at the name of the German Republic, it was socialist because socialism is murder. Communism is murder. Socialism always turns into communism. It always does. It just takes a little longer in certain places. All right, so 85 years ago in May, a small flotilla of lumber barges pulled up to the Nazinsky Island and offloaded about 3,000 settlers with orders to construct a special settlement as their little corner of Stalin's gulag. A network of labor camps that spread across the Soviet Union where millions of people were oppressed and killed was euphemistically called. At least 23 of the prisoners were already dead by the time they got there. Without tools or shelter or food and surrounded by armed guards who shot anyone who tried to brave the icy river, the prisoners quickly fell victim to starvation, disease, violence, and the brutal elements. And still, additional barges continued to pull up on the island. Numerous gruesome incidents of cannibalism reported, so many in fact that the locals came to call it Cannibal Island or the Island of Death. By August, at least 4,000 people were dead or missing. According to a Soviet document dated August 20th, 1933, there were only 2,200 survivors out of the 6,700 prisoners who had been sent to Nazinsky, a low-lying swampy strip some 3 kilometers long and about 600 meters wide. There's that cross. Took all these years later to erect it, too, because they don't want you to know about it. Only 300 of those survivors were deemed at the time fit for further work. Once a woman from the Island of Death was brought to our house, Feofila Bilina, a resident of the village of Nazino on the north bank of the Ob, recalled in an oral history in 1989. She was being taken to another camp. The woman was taken into the back room and spent the night, and I saw that her calves had been cut off. I asked, and she said, they did that to me on the Island of Death, cut them off and cooked them. All the meat on her calves was cut away. Her legs were freezing because of this, and she wrapped them up in rags. She was able to move on her own. She looked like an old woman, but really she was just a little over 40. The Nazinsky tragedy was the product of pitiless Soviet efficiency. Secret police head Genrik Yagoda and Matvey Berman, head of the Gulag system, dreamed up the brutal social engineering project aimed at quote-unquote resettling at least 2 million people in the remote reaches of Siberia and Soviet Kazakhstan. The idea was that the quote-unquote settlers would bring millions of hectares of land into cultivation and develop self-sufficient communities within 2 years. In part, the plan was aimed at covering up the ongoing famine in Ukraine and other parts of the country. Yeah, they were doing the Holodomor in Ukraine. We'll talk about that later. One was asked if he ate human meat. No, that is not true, he answered. I ate only livers and hearts. Generate quote-unquote settlers, the government reinstated the hated system of domestic passports that had been banned after the 1917 Bolshevik coup. Almost immediately, police throughout the country began rounding up anyone found in a place other than where they were registered. How did you end up here? We asked one young man, recalled Belina in her oral history. He said, I didn't do anything. I was a student in Moscow. On the weekend, I went to visit my aunt who lives in Moscow. I got to her apartment and knocked on the door, but before she opened the door, they grabbed me right there. I was arrested because I didn't have my passport with me. Vera Panovaya, a resident of the village of Ust-Tima, also gave an oral history in 1989, recalled meeting a man called Kuzma Salnikov who had been on Cannibal Island. He was a miner from Novokuznetsk, married with 2 children. Once he went to Novosibirsk and was stopped at the central market, Panovaya recalled. At that moment, they surrounded the market, set up a dragnet, and arrested everyone who wasn't carrying documents. Everyone, including women and children, was loaded onto a barge and sent to Nazinsky Island. Can you imagine not having your vaccine passport and being rounded up at the market? There was no food, she continued. People were tortured by hunger. The guards threw them bits of bread as they passed the island. If you got a piece, you ate. The rest had nothing. Salnikov was there, but he managed to escape. He swam the river and made it through the swamps to a village. After that, he worked on a collective farm. The police, however, worked too quickly. When the first 25,000 people arrived in Tomsk in April of 1933, can you imagine they arrested 25,000 people for not having some sort of passport or documents? Or was a dissident? Their camp had not been built. I mean, this is how the police, right? These are your neighborly police ready to arrest your ass. Prisoners continued to collect. Uh-oh. This cut off, didn't it? Maybe it didn't. Oh, it's still going. Okay. Sorry, guys. I thought it cut off and I didn't want to keep talking if it did. So they hadn't built the camp yet. Prisoners continued to collect, but they could not be transported further because the Ob and Tom rivers were still iced over. As was standard practice in Stalin's Gulag, common criminals were mixed in with the political prisoners as a means of maintaining an atmosphere of terror. Soviet documents preserved in the Gulag Museum in Tomsk record the interrogations of some of these criminals who were at Nizinsky Island. One was asked if he ate human meat. No, that is not true, he answered. I only ate livers and hearts. So they had Hannibal Lecter there. Nice. As for details, he said, it was very simple. Just like shashlik, we made skewers from willow branches, cut into pieces, stick it on the skewers, and roast it over the campfire. I picked those who were not quite living, but not yet quite dead, he added. It was obvious that they were about to go, that in a day or two they'd give up, so it was easier for them that way. Now, quickly, without suffering for another 2 or 3 days. Others described women who were tied to trees when men cut off their breasts, calves, and other body parts. Yeah, because women carry a little more fat than men, right? So they're going for the body fat. So if we're vegan, why weren't we eating the grass out there? Another common criminal whose interrogation survives bragged of beating prisoners to extract the gold in their dental work in order to get smokes, he said when asked why he did it. People need to smoke. From the guards, you could get a matchbook of tobacco or 2 whole newspapers for rolling cigarettes. The disaster on Cannibal Island was so horrifying that the local communist instructor named Vasily Velichko set out on his own initiative to investigate in July of 1933. Right? They actually, the cannibalism kicked off within 3 days of people being brought in April. It's freezing fucking cold in Russia and Siberia in April. Okay, so people were starting to get eaten 3 days in. He interviewed dozens of people and wrote an 11-page report that he sent to Moscow, Novosibirsk, and the district center at Narum. His report was stamped "quote unquote" top secret and only came to light in 1994. People began dying, he wrote. They burned to death alive while sleeping close to the fires. They died from exhaustion and cold. Immediately after the snow and frost came and rains and freezing winds, he continued, and the people were still left without food. Every fourth or fifth day, some rye flour was brought to the island and distributed to the settlers, a few hundred grams each. After getting their ration, the people ran to the water and mixed it with flour in their hats and ate it. Many people just ate the flour as it was, and since it was a powder, many suffocated from breathing it in. Zinsky Island, yeah, and these ones that actually mixed it with the river water, right, and just drank it like a paste, they died too because that gives you dysentery. Zinsky Island was finally evacuated on July 1933 when Velichko reached it in August. All the settlers were gone. The grass on the island was head high, he wrote in his report, but locals who went there to gather berries returned after discovering corpses in the grass and stick shelters full of skeletons. Yeah, and on the grass was having a good old meal, eating the corpses, because even grass isn't vegan. In 1989, the Tomsk branch of the Memorial Human Rights Group set an expedition to Nizinsky to gather oral histories. I went there from Tverskaya to cut hay. Nazno resident Taisia Chokarevaya told the memorial team about her trip to Nozinsky after the camp had been abandoned. I saw people washing their hands. I was holding my nose and thinking, what are they doing? They would wash their hands in and run back up. I saw they were collecting gold teeth. There was a state store then in Alexandrovsk. They took the gold there. Anyone who had gold took it there. They had some nice clothes, macaroni, and good food. Velichko's report caused a sensation in Moscow. The Communist Party sent a special commission to Nazino to investigate, and the facts of the report were largely confirmed. Several officials for the former camp were reprimanded and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 1 to 3 years. Velichko's report was labeled secret and tucked away in the archives. Velichko himself was fired from his party job. He later became a journalist and gained some fame. Yeah, so these prison guards, right? What they were doing is they were shooting people in the water if they tried to swim away and get to the land. Or if they did get to the land, they would actually go after them and hunt them like they were hunting hogs or something, right? Like or you're hunting foxes. They would hunt them down and shoot them. Right? And I actually read one account. There was a like a Russian soldier, and he was having sex with this 13-year-old Russian girl who was pretty, in exchange for food. And apparently one night he let her go, after giving her some food to eat and having sex with her. And she went back on the island, and the guys grabbed her and tied her to a tree and cut off her breasts and buttocks and, everything they could eat, and left her there alive. And the soldier heard of it and came there and tried to save her, but she had lost so much blood she died anyways. 3 days before cannibalism. And this is what people tell you is so great about Marxism, right? Communism is so great. The Armenian Genocide. This is one of the first things that they ever called a genocide, but they refused to acknowledge it for many years. Sometimes called the first genocide in the 20th century, the Armenian Genocide refers to the physical annihilation of Armenian Christian people living in the Ottoman Empire from the spring of 1915 through autumn 1916. There were approximately 1.5 million Armenians living in the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire in 1915. At least 664,000, as possible as many as 1.2 million, died during the genocide, either in massacres and individual killings or for systematic ill treatment, exposure, and starvation. The origin of the term genocide and its codification in international law have their roots in the mass murder of Armenians in 1915 and 1916. Lawyer Raphael Lemkin, a coiner of the word and later its champion at the United Nations, repeatedly stated that early exposure to newspaper stories about Ottoman crimes against Armenians was key to his beliefs about the need for legal protection of groups, a core element in the UN Genocide Convention of 1948. They didn't get to it until after World War II, right? Protection of groups, protection of all human beings. All of us have experienced one genocide or the other. I got a lot of evidence about that. Ottoman authorities, supported by auxiliary troops and at times by civilians, perpetrated most of the persecution and mass killing. The Ottoman government, controlled by the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, also called the Young Turks, aimed to solidify Muslim Turkish dominance in the regions of central and eastern Anatolia by eliminating the sizable Armenian presence there. Mass atrocities and genocide are often perpetrated within the context of war. Yeah, because that's what war is about. The destruction of the Armenians was closely linked to the events of World War I. Fearing that invading enemy troops would induce Armenians to join them, in spring 1915 the Ottoman government began the deportation of Armenian population from its northeastern border regions. In the months that followed, the Ottomans expanded deportations from almost all provinces regardless of distance from combat zones. So here in America and like Canada, they've been setting up camps. When you start seeing people being removed due to not having their vaccination, that would be a problem. But I don't know they're going to do that here. They may just let you starve where you stay, right? Because they'll have control over all the stores, and they'll have control over the currency, right? With their cryptocurrency quantum dot tattoo bullshit. The victims of the Armenian Genocide included people killed in local massacres that began in spring of 1950, others who died during deportations under conditions of starvation, dehydration, exposure, and disease, and Armenians who died in or en route to the desert regions of the Southern Empire today, which is northern and eastern Syria, northern Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. In addition, tens of thousands of Armenian children were forcibly removed from their families and converted to Islam. U.S. Ambassador to Constantinople Henry Morgenthau Sr. was deeply troubled by the atrocities committed against the Armenians and was among those who sought to rouse the world's conscience in response. The plight of the Armenians triggered an unprecedented public philanthropic response in the United States, including Woodrow Wilson, Hollywood celebrities, and thousands of Americans at the grassroots level who volunteered domestically and abroad and raised over 110 million, over 1 billion adjusted for inflation, to assist Armenian refugees and orphans. It's the same shit over and over again, right? It's the fear porn loop. You got the president and Hollywood celebrities, right? And then Americans give a lot of money, and then millions of people still die because they run off with the money. These creatures that rule over us take it. The Armenian Genocide cast a long shadow in the Holocaust era. Ambassador Morgenthau's son, Henry Morgenthau Jr., was Secretary of the Treasury in the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt, in part Due to his memories of the Armenian Genocide, Morgenthau Jr. was a key advocate for the establishment of the War Refugee Board, which rescued as many as 200,000 Jews from Nazi Europe. Perhaps most hauntingly, a novel about Armenian self-defense was secretly passed hand-to-hand among Jews imprisoned in the ghettos during the Holocaust, who saw it as an inspirational analogy to their plight and a call to resistance. They just get better at it, right? They just get better at killing people over time. We use the same tricks over and over. Let's talk about the Holodomor right now. So this was happening at the same time. This was happening. Nazano Island, Cannibal Island, right? 1933. The Holodomor, man-made famine that convulsed the Soviet Republic of Ukraine from 1932 to 1933, peaking in the late spring of 1933. It was part of a broader Soviet famine from 1931 to 34 that also caused mass starvation in the grain-growing regions of Soviet Russia and Kazakhstan. Well, why were they having a problem? Because Stalin took power and murdered all the freaking farmers he could, and he just kept it up. The Ukrainian famine, however, was made deadly by a series of political decrees and decisions that were aimed mostly or only at Ukraine. In acknowledgement of its scale, the famine from 1932 to 33 is often called the Holodomor, a term derived from the Ukrainian words for hunger, holod, and extermination, mor. The dead kid there in Kharkiv. Cause of the famine. The origin of the famine lay in the decision by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to collectivize agriculture in 1929. We are seeing collectivization of agriculture right now, right? We have let it happen. They've taken over the dairies, they've taken over the meat. They now want you eating fake meat. They're just doing it in a different way. It's the same thing. Trust me. Teams of Communist Party agitators forced peasants to relinquish their land, personal properties, and sometimes housing to collective farms, and they deported the so-called kulaks, who were wealthier peasants, as well as any peasants who resisted collectivization altogether. Collectivization led to a drop in production and disorganization of the rural economy and food shortages. It was also sparked by a series of peasant rebellions, including armed uprisings in some parts of Ukraine. And here we have another suspicious looking creature with a abnormally big mustache and no male zygomatic arch and no male jaw. I pretty much know what I'm gonna find if I go look at him. And there's a poor guy that died on the sidewalk that probably ended up buried somewhere and no one ever fucking remembered anything about him. The rebellions worried Stalin because they were unfolding in provinces which had, a decade earlier, fought against the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. I mean, they just never stopped with these wars and famines and shit, do they? He was also concerned by anger and resistance to the state agricultural policy within the Ukrainian Communist Party. If we don't make an effort now to improve the situation in Ukraine, he wrote to his colleague Lazar Kaganovich in August 1932, we may lose Ukraine. That autumn, the Soviet Politburo, the elite leadership of the Soviet Communist Party, took a series of decisions that widened and deepened the famine in the Ukrainian countryside. Farms, villages, and whole towns in Ukraine were placed on blacklist and prevented from receiving food. Peasants were forbidden to leave the Ukrainian Republic in search of food. Now, I want to tell you there's a New York State Green Market Food Hub. So I was working on this project. This is the second one of this. Grow NYC is a private public partnership, and it is a food hub. It's a warehouse. 120,000 square feet will greatly increase New Yorkers' access to the freshest, most nutritionally locally grown food. Now, this is supposedly, this was the tax-free job. This is supposedly a charity kind of thing. But it's very interesting that, this is the second one of two that I know that they're building. Here we go, 2021. They're finally starting building the second one, and I bid this like 5 times. We didn't win the job, but Kind of glad we didn't. These people have no idea what they're doing. The government wants to control, see, healthy, affordable foods for low-income communities. 60,000 square foot cold storage facility in Hunts Point, that's in the Bronx. Says it's going to give these farms unprecedented access to the New York City's wholesale marketplace. Prior to the COVID-19 health crisis, 1.4 million New York City residents were food insecure. Because of the pandemic, that number has jumped to approximately 2 million people. So these 2 million people are going to be dependent, right? And they're going to have to do what the government says they do to get food. And the government, why is the government in food at all? See what I mean? See how all of this in the history, they just keep getting better at this shit. All right, back to the Holodomor. Peasants were forbidden to leave the Ukrainian Republic in search of food. Despite growing starvation, food requisitions were not increased and aid was not provided in sufficient quantities. The crisis reached its peak in the winter of 1932-33 when organized groups of police and communist apparatchiks ransacked the homes of peasants and took everything edible from crops to personal food supplies to pets. Hunger and fear drove these actions, but they were reinforced by more than a decade of hateful conspiratorial rhetoric emanating from the highest levels of the Kremlin. See? Conspiratorial rhetoric. They do this every time. Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist, right? You have to label people a kulak. They have to label you non-vaccinated. They have to label you a dirty Jew. They have to label you, a dirty Armenian Christian. I mean, they have to label you something. They have to remove your humanity, right? In the modern age now, they're going to do it with the vaccine. Just watch. The result of Stalin's campaign was a catastrophe in spring 1933. It was a catastrophe for the people, but it wasn't a catastrophe for him. This is what he wanted. In spring 1933, death rates in Ukraine spiked. Between 1931 and 1935, at least 5 million people perished of hunger across the USSR. Among them, according to a study conducted by a team of Ukrainian demographers, there were at least 3.9 million Ukrainians. Police archives contain multiple descriptions of instances of cannibalism, as well as lawlessness, theft, and lynching. Mass graves were dug across the countryside. Hunger also affected the urban population, though many still survived thanks to ration cards. Still in Ukraine's large, see, if you got a ration card, you were being a good boy or girl. Still in Ukraine's largest cities, corpses could be seen on the streets. The famine was accompanied by a broader assault on Ukrainian identity. While peasants were dying in the millions, agents of the Soviet secret police were targeting the Ukrainian political establishment and intelligentsia. Yeah, they want to get rid of anyone who has any brains. The famine provided cover for a campaign of repression and persecution that was carried out against Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian religious leaders. Famine provided cover, right? The plague provides cover, right? The official policy of Ukrainianization, which had encouraged the use of Ukrainian language, effectively halted. Moreover, anyone connected with the short-lived Ukrainian People's Republic, an independent government that had been declared in June 1917 in the wake of the February Revolution, was dismantled after the Bolsheviks conquered Ukrainian territory, was subject to vicious reprisals. All those targeted by this campaign were liable to be publicly vilified, jailed, and sent to the Gulag, a system of Soviet prisons and forced labor camps, or executed. Knowing that this Russification program would inevitably reach him, Mykola Skripnik, one of the best-known leaders of the Ukrainian Communist Party, committed suicide rather than submit to one of Stalin's show trials. As the famine was happening, news of it was deliberately silenced by Soviet bureaucrats. Censorship. Party officials did not mention it in public. Western journalists based in Moscow were instructed to not write about it. Gosh, anything going on like here? Censorship? Like the modern day? One of the most famous Moscow correspondents at the time, Walter Duranty of the New York Times, went out of his way to dismiss reports of the famine. where they were published by a young freelancer, Gareth Jones, as he thought Mr. Jones's judgment was somewhat hasty. Jones was murdered under suspicious circumstances in 1935 in Japanese-occupied Mongolia. Stalin himself went so far as to repress the results of a census taken in 1937. The administrators of that census were arrested and murdered, in part because the figures revealed the decimation of Ukraine's population. Although the famine was discussed during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine in World War II, it became taboo again during the post-war years. The first public mention of the Soviet Union in the Soviet Union was in 1986 in the aftermath of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. That disaster too was initially kept secret by Soviet authorities. Do you see how much the government loves you? Because the famine was so deadly and because it was denied by the Kremlin for more than half a century, it has played a large role in Ukrainian public memory, particularly since independence. Ukrainian poet Ivan Drach was the first to speak publicly about the famine in 1986 after the Chernobyl disaster, citing it as an example of how damaging official silence can be. Well, it's on purpose. You think they want to admit so you would figure out that the government hates you? Of course not. They want to keep your power over you. They're willing to lie about anything, y'all. Everything. They will obscure everything they can. The Ukrainian government, as well as via the Ukrainian diaspora, the Holodomor Remembrance Day is observed around the world on the fourth Saturday of November. Ukraine has also invested in research on the famine. I mean, like, why was I never taught about this in school? Early 2019, 16 countries, as well as the Vatican, have recognized the Holodomor as a genocide, and both houses of the United States Congress 2019. That's how long it took them to talk about that. Recognize the Holodomor as genocide as both houses in the United States Congress has passed resolutions declaring that Joseph Stalin and those around him committed genocide against the Ukrainians in 1932 and 33. So, after the vaccine genocide, it'll take them another 70 years to admit it. They may never have to admit this one, since they're changing everybody's DNA. The Irish Holocaust, the mass graves of Ireland, the famine is a myth. Yeah, because it was caused, right? You can look this up, and a lot of people tell you, oh, it was just a famine, and the British didn't mean it, and you're good, and they love you. But the truth is they blockaded the ports, and they took, when the potato crop failed, they blockaded the ports. They stole all of the animals that the Irish had, like people don't need to eat potatoes in Ireland when they got all that grass and they got fish and they got lamb and they have cows. They took all the butter and all the milk and everything produced in 1 year and left them with nothing to eat. And they took that to feed the British because the British also had a potato blight that year as well. And they don't have, they didn't have the agricultural center that Ireland did. They didn't have as much agriculture going on. So they stole all that and they left them there to die. Ireland in 1845 and 1850 was entirely owned by English landlords, many of them lords temporal or spiritual, in estates typically of tens of thousands of acres. Their land titles were conquest-based. On these estates, the Irish were tenants at will on holdings of typically 3 to 8 acres, the rent of which they paid by typically 260 days of work annually on the landlord's estate. And they were born onto this, right? You're born onto this land, and you have a right to live on the land and work the land, and that's just how it was. And what happened is these lords wanted the peasants off the land, and they worked in conjunction with the Catholic Church. So what happened is if you wanted to go to the Catholic poorhouse, right, when you were on your last leg and you were starving to death, you had to sign over your right to this when you were born, this land that you were born on. You had to sign it over to the church, right, which returned it back to the landlord, and then they let you in the poorhouse and they starved you to death and killed you anyways. In the previous centuries, the Irish under British rule were non-persons, stripped of legal personhood except 5 steps. As murder requires personhood, the Irish were thus legally killable by any English person at will. Education was prohibited. No army of English seasonal migrants produced Ireland's vast and varied food crops. Other than landlords supporting groups of C of I Anglican clergy, his doctors, lawyers, newspaper owners, and military officers and police, the bureaucracy, etc., all of Ireland's agricultural production was by the Irish. In and around 1845 to 50, Ireland was a police state, 1590 police stations averaging 48 stations per county, with 8 policemen, a separate revenue police with 1,200, Castle Police, which were spies, 100 of them, and Dublin Metropolitan Police, 1,100. Each county had one landlord militia regiment, but Dublin, Mayo, and Limerick had 2 each, and Cork had 3. Ireland's abundance of meats, livestock, and other foods, though produced by the Irish, were claimed by the landlord. Upon international failure of potato crops, Ireland, starting in 1845, Ireland's food producers resisted police. Yeah, because you got to remember, back in those times, potatoes were either, if you were freaking dying, you were a peasant, right? You didn't have any money. They were fed to pigs. They were fed to animals because potatoes are animal food, right? They can actually do something with it. They can use their bacteria to ferment that into volatile fatty acids, and they can create meat that way. And you can't. Humans can stay alive if you eat butter on potatoes, or like buttermilk and potatoes. You could stay alive that way. You won't be super healthy, but you could stay alive quite a while like that, and you won't be as deficient as long as you're drinking that milk or that butter, because you're getting that fat that you can't make yourself. All right. Ireland's food producers resisted police and militia efforts to remove it to the ports for export. Regular army deployments into Ireland increased to 34 regiments in 1845 and 1846, 33 in 1847, 43 in 1848, 38 in 1849, and 40 in 1850. Full regiment/years for those 6 years in sequence were 23.04, 23.73, 29.91, 35.40, 31.83, and 30.0. Black 47 was the food removers' most active year. They were taking the food away. Deployment lag time explains why the 1848 peak of 35.4 regiments per year. More than half of Britain's army removed Ireland's food, 67 regiments of its 130 regiment total. On July 5, 1847, The Depths of Genocide, Lord Clarendon wrote from his vice-regal lodge in the Phoenix Park to Prime Minister Lord Russell. Sir Edward Blakeney says that the county is tranquil, and if it were not for the harassing duty of the escorting provisions, edibles, the troop would have little to do. The London Times contemporaneous reports of increased landings of Irish food in English ports were accessible in detail online. The genocidal mass evictions and robbery of crops continued until Land League boycott and the international outrage forced England to buy out its landlords from Ireland in 1900 and 1920. The vast estates were striped into 28-acre survival farms with an acre or two of the nearest bog for fuel, and allocated to the Irish cultivators of the soil. So munificent, so far above market price was that golden handshake to the departing landlords that the amortization period was set at 68.5 years. Thus my father and all our neighbours in County Roscommon, and presumably the rest of Ireland, were paying off that old debt into the 1970s. Ireland's farmers paid semi-annual rates, taxes, and those rents. Ireland's centuries of imposed destitution ended upon that of rent payment. In 1932, Ireland's Fianna Fáil government under De Valera withheld the annual £4 million in rent to London. Britain retaliated with an embargo on Irish goods, but it faded, approaching World War II. You just see how evil these freaking monsters are that own us. Just, oh. The use of massive armed force to starve Ireland belies the exculpable famine and its synonyms: great hunger, Holodomor, great hunger, great reset, great depression, great famine. Genocide is accurate. Great for who? Genocide is accurate, but no Irish person had ever used it. It was coined by post-World War II Raphael Lemkin to educate the U.S. Congress as to Nazis' crimes against Jews. An appropriately unculpable label was used to report events in Ireland starting in 1846. Writers David Fitzgerald et al. And the Cork Examiner, not the Irish Examiner, repeatedly reported it as a Holocaust. Famine to Freedom is a film is a recent concealment of Holocaust and the Britain's army's perpetration of it. Academics, they pretended not to recognize the grain reaping hook sickle they excavated in the Ballykilcline, Strokestown. Their potato famine film ignores the following non-potato food producers of 1845 to 1850 Ireland. 1979 grain mills, 1975 grain kills, 929 livestock pounds, 251 tuck mills, 450 other mills, 420 flour mills, 132 breweries, 72 distilleries, 68 malt kilns, 58 threshers, 44 woolen mills, 50 windmills, butter churning mills, sheepfolds, pig markets, corn markets, bacon stores, etc. Hundreds of Ireland's Holocaust mass graves remain unmarked due to the fear of the royal bail. And they have a map down here. Yeah, I went to the mass graves there in Dublin. It is just, it's really sad because it's like this beautiful grass on top of this lump, giant lump. Irish men and Irish women read this sight and weep. Weep for the agonies and deaths of your people at the hands of the genocidists. The authorities who imposed the curriculum, the teachers and professors who funneled it to you and have carefully kept you informed as to which British regiment or any regiment that murdered your people. Until now, that information was kept from you. You had no access to it, you do now. You can read it on your computer screen. So all of these are the mass graves of Ireland, where all these flags are. Britain's cover-up. The cover-up is accomplished by the same British terrorism and bribery that perpetrated the genocide. Consider, why does Irish President Mary Robinson call it Ireland's greatest natural disaster, while she conceals the British Army's role? Potato blight, Phytophthora infestans, did spread from America to Europe in 1844, to England, and then to Ireland in 1845, but it didn't cause famine anywhere. Ireland did not starve for potatoes, it starved for food. Yeah, and they also don't mention in here how the British ships blockaded the ports and stopped American ships from coming in with food to save the Irish, right? They ended up being allowed to put these starving Irish on these ships, stack them on there like wood. And most of them died before going over to Canada and America. That's how we got so many Irish here in America. And that's another story. Ireland starved because its food, from 40 to 70 shiploads per day, was removed at gunpoint by 12,000 British constables, reinforced by the British militia, battleships, excise vessels, Coast Guard, and by 200,000 British soldiers, 100,000 at any given moment. The attached map shows never before published names and locations in Ireland of the food removal regiments. Disposition of the Army Public Record Office, London, et al., of which we possess photocopies. Thus, Britain seized the Ireland's producers tens of millions of head of livestock, tens of millions of tons of flour, grains, meat, poultry, and dairy products, enough to sustain 18 million persons. And there were only 2 million people on this freaking island at the time. The Public Record Office recently informed us that their British regiment's daily activity reports of 1845 to 1850 have gone missing. Of course they did. Those records include each regiment's cattle drives and grain cart convoys it escorted at gunpoint from the Irish districts assigned to it. Also, quote unquote, missing are the receipts issued by the British Army commissariat officers in every Irish port tallying the cattle and tonnage of foodstuffs removed. Likewise, the exporting lading manifest. Other records provide all revealing glimpses of the missing data, such as. Now, so when I went to Ireland twice, when I went to Ireland, you can actually go and see these houses, right? They have these stone houses because Ireland's very rocky, and they made their houses out of stone, and they're still standing. You know, the people starved to death, and the stone. A lot of these buildings are still standing to this day. The food removal from Cork Harbor, I love Cork City, from Cork Harbor on one day in 1847, the Ajax steamed for England with 1,515 firkins of butter, 102 casks of pork, 44 hogsheads of whiskey, 844 sacks of oats, 247 sacks of wheat, 106 bales of bacon, 13 casks of ham, 145 casks of porter, 12 sacks of fodder, 28 bales of feathers, 8 sacks of lard, 296 boxes of eggs, 30 head of cattle, 90 pigs, 220 lambs, 34 calves, and 69 miscellaneous packages. On November, they just seized everything. They're like the fucking Grinch that stole Christmas. On November 14th, 1848, sailed from Cork Harbor alone 147 bales of bacon, 120 casks and 135 barrels of pork, 5 casks of ham, 140 casks of miscellaneous provisions, foodstuffs, 1,996 sacks and 950 barrels of oats, 300 bags of flour, 300 head of cattle, 239 sheep, 9398 firkins of butter, 542 boxes of eggs. On July 28, 1848, a typical day's food shipments from only of the following 4 ports on Limerick: the Anne, John Geese, and the Messenger for London, the Pelton Clinton for Liverpool and the city of Limerick, British Queen and the Cambrian Maid for Glasgow. This one day removal of Limerick's food was of 863 firkins of butter, 212 firkins, 1,198 casks and 200 kegs of lard, 87 casks of ham, 267 barrels of bacon, 52 barrels of pork, 45 tons and 628 barrels of flour, 75 barrels of oats, and 1,000 barrels of barley. I mean, this is in one day, y'all, from Limerick. And you think about it, they were bringing it to Britain and they were selling it all around the world for money and starving the poor Irish to death. From Kilrush, the Ellen for Bristol, Charles G. Fryer, and Mary Elliott for London. This one-day removal was 550 tons of County Clare's oats and 15 tons of its barley. From Tralee, the St. John Barb, Claudia, and Queen for London, the spokesman for Liverpool. This one-day removal was of 711 tons of Kerry's oats and 118 tons of its barley. From Galway, the Mary, Victoria, and Diligence for London, the Swan and Union for Limerick, probably for transshipment to England. This one-day removal was of 60 sacks of County Galway's flour, 30 sacks and 292 tons of its oatmeal, 294 tons of its oats, and 140 tons of its miscellaneous provisions, foodstuffs. British soldiers forcibly removed it from starving Limerick, Clare, Kerry, and Galway producers. In Belmullet, County Mayo, the mission of 151 soldiers of the 49th Regiment, in addition to exporting livestock and crops to the port for export, was to guard a few tons of stored meal from the hands of the starving, its population falling from 237 to 105, so they lost more than half of everybody between 1841 and 1851. Belmullet was also lost its source of fish in January 1849 when Britain's Coast Guard arrested its fleet of enterprising fishermen 10 miles at sea in the act of offloading flour from a passing ship. They were sentenced to prison and their currachs were confiscated. And how anyone can say this was not, it's just horrible. They say it was an accident, it was a famine, it was a natural disaster. The Waterford Harbour British Army Commissariat officer wrote to the British Treasury Chief Charles Trevelyan in April 24, 1846. The barges leave Clonmel, once a week from this place, with the export supplies under convoy, which last Tuesday consisted of 2 guns, 50 cavalry, and 80 infantry, escorting them on the banks of the Square as far as Carrick. While its people starved, the Clonmel district exported annually, along with other foreign produce, approximately 60,000 pigs in the forms of cured pork. Voices in the wilderness. There were many voices in the wilderness, risking all to stop the genocide. For example, Wexford-born Jane Wilde, mother of the Oscar and poetess, wrote under the nom de plume Speranza in the United Irishman newspaper the following verses, 1 through 6, printed here. During the depths of 1847, RE, the British genocidists, and the innocents they were exterminating. The famine year. Weary men, what reap ye? Golden corn for the stranger. What sow ye? Human corpses that await for the avenger. Fainting forms, all hunger-stricken, what do you see in the offing? Stately ships to bear our food away amid the strangers' scoffing. There's a proud array of soldiers, what do they round your door? They guard our master's granaries from the thin hands of the poor. Pale mothers, wherefore weeping? Would to God that we were dead. Our children swoon before us, and we cannot give them bread. We are wretches, famished, scorned, human tools to build your pride, but God will take will yet take vengeance for the souls for whom Christ died. Now is your hour of pleasure, bask ye in the world's caress, but our whitening bones against ye will arise as witnesses. From the cabins and the ditches in their charred and coffined masses, from the angel of the trumpet will know them as he passes. A ghastly spectral army before God will stand and arraign ye as our murderers, O spoilers of the land. Mrs. Wild evidently knew that British arms controlled every field of Ireland. Small detachments resided as far away as 40 miles from their garrisons shown on the map. The absence of army garrisons in County Derry indicates that its royalist militia adequately reinforced its constabulary. Bayonets, cannons, rifles, the lash, evictions, and the gallows were freely used to seize Irish food on the pretext that it was the property of some English quote-unquote owner by robbery, nearly all of whom were absentees. But Wilde couldn't have known each regiment's identity. We discovered them in the Public Record Office, Kew Gardens, London, in 1983, while researching material for my paternal grandfather's biography. It was just as available to the Irish government subsidized authors and academicians. Their Big Lie campaign is shocking. Perhaps this brochure will encourage them finally to tell the truth that British perpetrated a Holocaust in Ireland. You know what the word Holocaust means, right? It means fiery sacrifice. So I don't know that you should even use it here because they weren't burning these people, right? They claim that they were burning the Jews, hence the term Holocaust, fiery sacrifice. Definitely genocide, though. Just semantics. The official British intent of the time is revealed by its actions and enactments. When the European potato crop failed in 1844 and food prices rose, Britain ordered regiments to Ireland. When blight hit the 1845 potato crop, the English potato crop, its food removal regiments were already in Ireland, ready to start. The Times editorial of September 30th, 1845 warned, in England, the two main meals of a working man now consists of potatoes. England's potato dependency was excessive and reckless. Grossly overpopulated relative to its food supply, England faced famine unless it could import vast amounts of alternative food. But it didn't grab merely Ireland's surplus food or enough Irish food to save England. It took more for profit and to exterminate the people of Ireland. Queen Victoria's economist, Nassau Sr., expressed his fear that existing policies will not kill more than 1 million Irish in 1848, and that will scarcely be enough to do much good. When an eyewitness urged to stop to the genocide in progress, Trevelyan replied, "We must not complain of what we really want to obtain." Trevelyan insisted that all reports of starvation were exaggerated until 1847. He then declared it ended and refused entry of the American food relief ship Sorcy. Thomas Carlyle, influential British essayist, wrote, "Ireland is like a half-starved rat that crosses the path of an elephant. What must the elephant do? Squelch it, by heavens, squelch it." Total annihilation is suggested the Times leader of September 2nd, 1846, and in its 1848, its editorialist crowned, "A Celt will soon be as rare on the banks of the Shannon as a red man on the banks of Manhattan." The immortal Society of Friends, the Quakers, did all in their power to save lives, but in 1847 they despaired and quit upon learning the Crown planned to perpetuate the genocide's pretext, the British claim of ownership of Irish land. Quakers refused to facilitate the genocide by pretending, as concern does RE African genocides, that it was an act of nature. In the 1870s, too late, British laws were enacted allowing the Irish to buy back the land which Britain had robbed them of. Twice yearly payments were extracted from Ireland's farmers until that debt was paid off in the 1970s. Ireland's diet since prehistory has been meat, dairy products, grains, fruit, and vegetables, latterly supplemented by potatoes. Central to its ancient legend are its livestock, reaping hooks, flails, cairns, and grain kilns and mills. The many conical grain mills and mills shown on the Irish Ordnance Survey map of 1837 to 1841 operated continually prior to, during the starvation, and subsequent to it in the 1940s when I observed them still working. Local farmers dried and milled their grain, not potatoes in them, and this oatmeal and flour were seized and exported by British forces. The potato famine Big Lie was underway and already denounced by John Mitchell in his United Irishmen in 1847. He was soon sent in chains to a Tasmanian death camp, but escaped. 50 years later, G.B. Shaw wrote in Man and Superman, Malone, my father died of starvation in Ireland in the Black 47. Maybe you've heard of it. Violet, the famine? Malone, with smoldering passion, no, the starvation. When a country is full of food and exporting it, there can be no famine. He kept mum on the British Army's roll. The Ireland's whole truth tellers don't receive Nobels. To date, the big lie prevails. It started, I heard of the potato famine, but I had to go to Ireland and actually start looking into it and reading the books over there to even hear about it. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this either. They were stripped of its food, and internationally, it was begging help for the starving Irish, the British government, right? This is how they roll. They do this every time. The British government genocidally stripped Ireland of its abundant foodstuff. Internationally, it was begging for the help of for the starving Irish. See what they do? They do it all the time. It's the same things as the fear porn movie. Many will perhaps be surprised to learn neither Ireland nor anybody in Ireland ever asked alms or favors of any kind from either England or from any other nation or people. On the contrary, it was England herself that begged for us, asking a penny for the love of God to relieve the poor Irish, and further constituting herself the almoner and agent of all that charity. She, England, took all the profit of it. Mitchell again, thus any man who had a house, no matter how wretched, was to pay the new tax, and every man was bound to have a house, for if found out of doors after sunset and convicted of that offense, he was to be transported for 15 years or imprisoned for 3. The court to have the discretion of adding hard labor or solitary confinement. This law would drive the survivors of ejected people, those who did not die of hunger, into the poorhouses or to America, because being bound to be at home after sunset and having curfew, and having neither house nor home, they would be in the absolute power of the police and in continual peril of transportation to the colonies, the Australian slave labor camps. By another act of Parliament, the police force was increased. You never hear about this. And taken more immediately into the service of the Crown, the Irish counties were in part relieved from their pay, and they became, in all senses, a portion of the regular army. They mounted to 12,000 chosen men, well armed and drilled. The police were always at the command of the sheriffs. See, they even take the police and made them into the military like they've done in America already. You see this? It's very sad. It's even happening in Canada now, right? You've got the Gestapo coming after this priest. I'll show you this little clip here. So this is a Polish preacher, Artur Pawlowski, and he's been having to throw these guitar. They came again. He has been feeding the homeless for 20 years, and they come to his church to shut them down because of COVID-19. And he's been fined like $1,000 fines for feeding the homeless.
And living better. Professional grade power that's felt, not heard. Whether you're making memories, making a deal, or making history, visit Theragun.com and change the way you move.
I won't let you go through this.
Get out. Get out of this property. Immediately get out. Immediately Gestapo. It's not allowed. Out. Do you understand English? Get out of this property. Go. So go. Go. And don't come back without the warrant. Out, Nazi.
Canadian pastor Artur Pawlowski, after police and a public health inspector walked into his church in Alberta, Canada, and interrupted a religious celebration on Saturday night. And something else. The officer said that they were trying to enforce COVID orders. The pastor says they did not have a warrant to do so. And now he's calling on Canadians to rise up against intimidation. Artur Pawlowski, founder and pastor of Street Church Ministries, joins us now from Alberta, Canada. Pastor, thank you so much for coming on. It's good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
So, I mean, right after all this happened, officers left the church. You had some choice words for them. I want to play just a little bit of that first. Let's go ahead and listen.
Passover, the holiest Christian festival in a year, and they're coming to intimidate Christians during the holiest festival? Unbelievable. What is wrong with those sick psychopaths?
So, first off, talk about the church, the Passover service you had Saturday night. Talk about that, what it is, and also explain what happened.
Well, they have been harassing us for the past 13 months, just like around the world, because of the pandemic. They have been coming to our church services. They have been coming in big numbers. Our record for Christmas festival is 100 police officers, 52 police cruisers. So they have been doing this intimidation, harassment tactics for a while. And I told them over and over again, do not you dare to come to our church. Do not come inside. Do not intimidate our children, our elderly, our women. Do not do that. It's against the law. It's actually a criminal offense, punishable with 5 years jail time. And this most holy day, Passover celebration during Shabbat, they just walk in like it was their house. And I was completely taken by surprise. I didn't know what to do. So the only thing I did was kick them out.
Yeah. Is this a Christian? Are you Christian? Is it Jewish? Can you tell me a little bit about the church?
We are Christians. We are Pentecostals, feeding the homeless people on the streets of Calgary, and also congregate in the building. And
and it looks like you got some of your people behind you there. You have a group of supporters.
Yeah, they all came to support. Those are Walk for Freedom champions, freedom fighters. Canadians have enough. We have enough. Enough is enough. More and more Canadians are rising up. More and more people are finally saying, this is crazy. They're going too far. This is not about health. This is about terror.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of people in this country that feel exactly the same way, especially when you look at some of the nonsensical things. You can't go into a church, but you can pack an airplane. And it's a reflection here of what's happening in this country. We can show you a little bit of this. You've had religious leaders have been fined, arrested, sued for holding services, breaking COVID protocol, especially really in the early days of the pandemic. Officials in your community, I understand, want stricter lockdowns and even more rules after they've seen an uptick in cases. You're telling Canadians to stand up against this. What should they do?
Well, I have been warning Canadians for the past 60 years. As you can tell, I am an immigrant from behind the Iron Curtain. I grew up under communist dictatorship. So when this started to happen, I was yelling at the top of my voice from the rooftops, if you will. I was telling Canadians, come on, this is not good. What is going to happen is this is going to intensify, you're going to lose all your rights. The Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the police will start to invade your private properties, your businesses, your churches. At that time, Canadians were not willing to listen, but behold, now this message hits home more and more in Nebraska. Now more and more people coming. We have people showing up at the Walk for Freedom rally. So that's a good news. My message to the Americans and to the Western civilization is rise up, stand up. They came for me today. Be sure of it. They will come for you if you will not rise up. If you will not stand up and push this people away, it's going to show up at your door. It's time to stand up.
Yeah, it's been a year. People are sick of being locked up, that's for sure. And this is not the first time you've been approached by the cops, apparently. Last year you were fined $1,000 for feeding the homeless. Canadian conservative news outlet Rebel Media covered this story. We can take a quick listen to that.
We are providing necessities of life to those that you and your bosses refuse to provide. You got all kinds of events happening right now, and yet the Calgary's finest are not bothering them. This is the hypocrisy of this city. This is the hypocrisy of our wonderful, fearless leaders.
Had a lot of police show up for that. You're out there feeding the homeless. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and they have been harassing us for 13 months. They're saying that we are not allowed to feed the homeless people. And, let's take note that the people that we're feeding are people that no one else takes care of. Those are people living under the bridges, bushes. They're not allowed in the regular shelters. So there's a choice. Either they will whack your head and they will break into your home, or a ministry like mine will feed them. I have been feeding people for the past 22 years. I feed thousands of homeless people in the streets of Calgary, and the city of Calgary hates it. This incident, I was surrounded by 12 officers. I was the first clergyman in Canada to receive this fine, the COVID ticket. Since then, I got 28 of them, and I guess I was told they will be coming.
That is something else. Real quick, just to end, some people would look at the crowd behind you and say nobody has a mask on. Why is that?
Because they love freedom. You see, if you want to wear a muzzle on your face like a little puppy, that's your choice. Those people behind me are lions, they're eagles, and you know what? Lions and eagles are free, the hyenas are slaves. We want to be free people, they are free people.
I get it. Pastor Artur Pawlowski. So thank you so much for coming on the show. Good to see you. Our neighbors to the
Thank
north.
you so much.
All right.
Thank you so much. Be blessed. God bless.
See, this guy is so brave. He has a great channel. But I see a lot of parallels between what's going on now, right? And then like Oregon. Let me spell it right. These bills, right, that they're putting. Oh, I don't remember what the name of it is, but there's a bill to outlaw livestock. And there's also one in Florida. Colorado. I don't like to keep saying Florida. Sorry. Anyways, and fake meat and all of that. It's all part of a big plan. It's very interesting. I don't know that there's much of escape for this time, unless more people actually stand up and don't take this routine, right? But as you can see by the muzzles, there's not a lot of will for that. All right, that's enough. Enough talking. Thanks, guys.